steel. And there would be, you know, a lot of survivalists and things like that. They would say it's not really an ideal survival or bushcrafting knife because it's D2 steel. And the reason why is because it's super, super, super hard steel, which means that it's potentially hard to sharpen. And if you're in a wilderness or long-term survival situation, you've got to be able to resharpen your knife. So if you don't have any materials sharp enough or harder than this steel, it's really hard to sharpen. Another thing is that if you're using some sort of like a flint or some sort of like a poserium rod, actually for a poserium rod this is probably fine, but for the flint, again, the steel is actually too hard, and so when you're doing a flint, what's actually happening is the stone is really sharp and it's really hard, and it's actually sparking the metal, right? Because it's high carbon steel. And just like when you're burning leaves or wood, it's that carbon that's actually burning. You just need a much, right? So in order to get the metal to combust, to turn into a spark, to burn, it's got to be combustible enough for the flint to be able to spark it. With a super hard knife like this, you're going to have a very difficult time, maybe even an impossible time, getting a spark with a flint. Because it's too hard. So the reasons why this knife is not good for a wilderness survival situation also potentially is why it is good. And the reason why it is good is because it is so hard, it's not going to dull. You're not going to have to sharpen it very often. Once you get it sharp, you take that time to get it sharp, it stays sharp. It's going to cut through anything. There's basically almost nothing you're going to find that's harder, right, than a well-tempered D2 steel. So that's what I really love about it. Also, because the molecules are so tightly packed and it's so hard and it's sort of an alloy, it's also relatively, for a high carbon steel blade of this quality, it's relatively water resistant. A lot of high carbon blades, so you know, most generally speaking, like a 1090 or a 1095 steel is what's going to be considered the best steel for a survival blade. And the reason why is because 1090, 1095 is a super high carbon blade. It's really strong, it's really high quality, it's got a lot of strength, but it's also got a lot of hardness. Strength and hardness are actually different things. Right, so hardness is like on the Richter scale of hardness. A diamond is going to be the hardest, right? So a diamond's going to be harder than D2 steel. It's one of the few things that's going to be harder than a D2 steel. But it's also potentially going to be more brittle. It's going to be too hard. So in a good blade, you actually want to have a balance of toughness and hardness. If it's too hard, it's prone to chipping. Right? So if you hit it on a rock or something that's really hard, you may either chip your blade or crack your blade, which is potentially not good. When you've got a blade that's got a little bit of strength to it and not just hardness, you're less prone to breaking or chipping. It's going to have some sort of a bend to it. Right? So it's softer, it dulls easier, it's not as hard, but it's sort of like a tree. Right? A tree is perfect because it's really hard, but it's also flexible. It also has flex. Right? It's got toughness, it's got strength. So again, this is why there's no such thing as a perfect steel for a blade, because if you're using something like a machete or a tomahawk, right, that you're throwing or you're hitting with big strokes, right? If you have a really hard steel like D2 steel, it's probably going to chip. So most machetes and or axes or hatchets, things like that, are going to have more of a softer steel. It's going to be like a 1040 instead of a 1090 or a 1095. That just means it has less carbon content. Less carbon content, it's less hard, more tough. Okay? So, again, there is no perfect knife. There is no best steel. But I really love the D2 steel, especially for an everyday carry knife with the way I live, because I have access to really high quality sharpening stones, diamond stones, things of that nature where I can sharpen this relatively easily. And it stays sharp. I very rarely ever have to sharpen it, and I can always rely on it being sharp. A less hard blade is going to have to be sharpened more. So I really love the D2 steel blades. I'm a big fan of them for many reasons. The stainless steel aspect, it's not stainless steel. And stainless steel, as far as performance of a blade goes, is never going to compare to like a high carbon 1090 or 1095 or some sort of like a true Japanese folded Damascus steel. Right? It's never gonna compare. And that's why that's why all the best blades are made out of like 1090, 1095, or some sort of like a true Damascus, a true folded Japanese steel, because they've got a perfect balance of strength and toughness. But they have certain weaknesses to them, certain factors that make this more ideal. One of those is the rusting factor. So here I've got a Damascus blade, which is super cool and super beautiful, but as you can see, it's got like a full rust coating on there. Now, unless it's constantly getting rusted like this and I'm constantly cleaning it, it's not really that big of a deal, because this is just like a moist air rust. It hasn't really actually been sitting in water, it's just been in a Texas humidity, right? So when you have a Damascus steel or a high carbon steel, it rusts really easy. You basically have to constantly keep them dry, you have to constantly keep them oiled. And this is, again, another drawback to a really nice 1090 or 1095 or Damascus steel, is that it rusts really easily. So having some sort of a stainless steel blade, right, even though the metal is inferior, right, if you were to have two swords, one sword was made out of 1095, perfectly forged, perfectly tempered, and then you had a stainless steel sword, perfectly forged, perfectly tempered, if they were to, fight each other, the 1090, 1095 steel would destroy. It would completely destroy the stainless steel blade. It would be completely inferior, right? But if you were living on the ocean and you were in the sea, it would probably actually be better to have that stainless steel blade versus the 1095, because keeping that 1095 from rusting and actually using it is almost impossible, right? So it's like it's inferior, but it's superior, both at the same time. So like here, for example, we've got a hunting knife. It's not a hunting knife, it's more of a skinning knife. And the reason why it's a skinning knife is because there's no point on it. Really the best skinning knives are ones that don't have points, because when you're skinning, you're much less likely to puncture or cut the hide, the pelt. So it's got this rounded tip on there. It's real easy to just sort of scrape the skin, right, without puncturing it or without slicing it open. You also want it to be relatively small. You want it to be relatively lightweight. You want it to be really agile, right? This is stainless steel, so as far as the full capacity and capability of the blade, it's inferior to a 1090. But if you're taking this out in the woods and you're exposed to a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, you're getting it bloody, right? It's going to rust. You're going to have to constantly keep, polishing it. You're going to have to constantly keep oiling it, which is kind of a pain in the ass. So if you have access to, a stainless steel blade, and you're not going to be putting your life on the line for it, in a lot of ways, stainless steel is the way to go. And that's part of why I love this the D2 steel, is because as far as the quality of the blade goes, it is really, really, really high quality, but it's also got a little bit more stainless steel, a little bit of rust resistance to it, unlike, a Damascus blade such as this, or a high carbon steel blade. This blade rusts real easy. I've got to keep it oiled, or I've got to, keep cleaning it. The Damascus is going to rust the easiest. Again, it's easily cleanable. I've just got this for a demonstration, really. But it requires a lot more maintenance. A stainless steel blade or a D2 blade is going to require way less maintenance. So it's got its downsides. It's also got its superior qualities. What other kind of blades do we have here? This is more like a dagger. This is a double-edged blade. And this is also D2 steel. In my mind, D2 steel is one of my favorite steels, and it's also a really good steel for a double-edged dagger, because really what you want out of this dagger, this isn't like necessarily an everyday all-day use practical carry knife. One, it's illegal. Most places have daggers, double-sided blades are illegal. You're going to have, again, mafia with guns show up and literally threaten your life. So it's not very practical if you live in civilization. Number two, it's a little bit more dangerous, right? It's double-sided, so you're more likely to cut yourself. You can't put your thumb on the edge of the blade. See, like this, I can put my thumb here, and it gives me all sorts of whittling and power-cutting abilities. This, you can't do that. You've got, you're holding it like this, so when you've got the pressure here, it's weak in the hand. You can't put your thumb on there. So it's really not as practical. This really is more of like an assassin blade. This is more like a fighting blade. This is something that is sharp on both sides. It's always sharp. The really beneficial everyday practicality of a double-edged blade is that you have two sides. So say one of the sides you can be using throughout the day, you can keep using, but the other side you never use. That way it's always razor sharp. And if you ever actually need the razor sharp blade, it's there. That side is razor sharp. With a knife like this, even though it's D2 steel, once you've used it for a while, it's going to be less sharp than razor sharp. Having a razor sharp edge requires a mass amount of maintenance. If you look at the old school barbers, right, that have those razors and they're literally shaving people's skin, pulling off all of that, they say the closest shave is one of those real razor shaves, and that's because it's so sharp, right? They're sharpening it every single time. Every single time they go to shave somebody, they're resharpening that knife and they're stropping it, right? They're getting a razor's edge on there. In fact, really, to get a razor's edge, you need more than a stone. You have to use a strop, a leather strop. And it gets the edge super, super fine. All a sharp edge is a super fine molecular structure. So if you look at the edge of a blade under a microscope, the sharper it is, the smoother that edge will be. The duller it is, the rougher it'll look. You can't tell when you look at it with your eye, it looks super smooth. But when you look at it under a microscope, it's real jagged if it's dull, and it's real smooth if it's sharp. It's just a finer, thinner, smoother edge. So anyways, it's really hard to have a razor's edge. So with a double-edged blade like this, you can actually use it, right? And the side that you use won't really very often be razor sharp, but it'll still be sharp enough, especially if it's D2 steel, because it stays sharp for a really long time. But then you have the other edge, which is always razor sharp. And if you ever need that razor sharp edge, you've got the razor sharp edge without having to, go and sharpen it to be able to use it. So that's really epic. It also looks really cool, feels good in the hand. I really love this knife. It's one of my favorites. A lot of people also really love this knife.